Hi, my name is Mark Rader, and I'm the senior pastor of Gymea Baptist Church here in southern Sydney in Australia. And wherever you're watching this, whether it's in Australia or around the world, we're delighted to welcome you to this new series of New Horizons TV entitled Follow Me. This 15-week sermon series explores the implications of what it means to follow after Jesus. And like the Gospels, it includes not only an invitation to begin to follow Jesus, but also the call to continue to do so. You see, as the Gospel makes clear, you don't have to believe in Jesus to begin to follow Him. You don't have to know a great deal about Him to begin to follow Him. You don't even need to have the right kind of behaviors to begin to follow Him. But as Matthew makes very, very clear, the longer you follow Jesus, the more inevitable it becomes that you will come to a crisis point where you have to decide what you believe about Him. The Gospel makes that incredibly clear. And so this sermon series is going to be exploring both of those implications, not only for those who are beginning to follow Jesus, but for those who have decided that they do believe in Him, have placed their faith in Him, and are still nonetheless called to continue to follow. I've been really challenged by this series myself. I've been challenged to not be content with just being a believer or just knowing a lot about Jesus, or even to be content with the changes that have been taking place in my life. I've been reminded once again how important it is that I see myself first and foremost as a follower of Jesus. And I hope and pray that you will be likewise challenged. As with all of these series that we've produced for New Horizons TV, you can actually download the life group notes for this series off of our church website, www.gymeabaptist.org.au. And we'd love for you to be able to use those if they're helpful. And if you'd like to be in touch with us, you can also contact us anytime you like through our website. And if you're ever in town, why don't you stop by for a service? But until then, enjoy this series, be challenged by it, and consider what it means for you to follow Jesus.
You are calling us to follow. You are calling us to trust. You are seeing all our tomorrows. Greater things are yet to come. You lead us to new horizons.
With today's sermon in our series, Follow Me, the life and teachings of Jesus, here's Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
The verb to follow has, in the last 10 or 15 years, undergone a bit of a change. They've added a definition to it. If you ever look up the word to follow, you'll find that it actually has a fair number of definitions already, but in the last 10 or 15 years, another one has been added. And it's a subset of the verb meaning to pay attention to something, which is to track a person, group, or organization by subscribing to their account on social media websites and applications. Right, so whether we're talking about a podcast that as soon as it is uploaded is downloaded to your device or your phone or your iPad or whatnot, whether it's a blog that you follow, whether it's Facebook on someone that you have friended, or if I can say traditional about something like Twitter and Instagram, the traditional following of people on Instagram and Twitter. And this has perhaps become the most familiar and common use of the word to follow. So if I told you that I'm following someone, you probably would not think that I'm stalking them in terms of a literal following, nor would you think that I was necessarily following them as a mentor of mine, as an example to me, I don't know, a church leader or a theologian or a Bible lecturer or whatnot, who I spent a great deal of time with and read all of their material and whose teachings I then propounded. You'd probably ask, whose account is it and can I follow them as well? You'd want to know whether there was a photo thing or a blog thing or a Facebook thing and go from there. And so it might be useful for us as we begin this series to consider once again what it means to follow when we're talking about following after Jesus. And this series, which is entitled Follow Me, is designed to help us think through what it means to follow Jesus, to consider the implications of His life, His teaching, and the claims that He makes, and what it means for us to live that stuff out. And we want to begin today by looking at this call of Jesus, of His very first disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, He saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, Follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. And maybe it's the fact that follow me has taken on a social media kind of aspect for me, but I read this perhaps a little bit differently than I have in the past. There are a bunch of really curious things in this text, some really curious elements of this call to follow Jesus that I think is worth exploring. I want to begin by pointing out the kind of people that Jesus invites to follow him. They're kind of an odd group, wouldn't you say? If you've been in churches for a while, you're probably used to the fact that Jesus called some fishermen, and you don't think twice about it. But it's actually a little bit strange. And it's not just that they were fishermen. It's also that they were fishermen in Capernaum. If you were going to start a movement amongst Jews in the first century, if you really wanted the Jewish people to get on board, if you really wanted to do something that would shake and change the world, you wouldn't start in Capernaum and you wouldn't start with fishermen, right? It's just the way it is. Capernaum was kind of on the outskirts of kind of Judaism, right? It was in an area that was not nearly as central as Jerusalem. And so for Jesus to begin his ministry there is quite odd. Normally, you would expect anyone who had any kind of pretense of wanting to change the world to start in Jerusalem. It'd be like starting a consultant business for government workers and not setting up in Canberra. But finding some really small town in the Northern Territory and starting your government consulting business there. It would just be a little bit strange. Could you make it work? Well, because of the internet, probably. But in reality, you'd probably want to go where the business is. And if you wanted to start something big, you want to try to identify the right sorts of team members, don't you? And fishermen probably aren't it. Nothing against fishermen, but in terms of worldwide movements, that's not where I would start. Surely you start with the high priest, some of the religious leaders, the influential rabbis of the day, the aristocracy, the nobility, the movers and shakers within Judaism. Those would be the people you'd want to start with, but Jesus doesn't. He starts with this kind of odd group in an odd place. And there's something else that's odd about this. As I understand first century discipleship, if I were looking to gain disciples, what I would do is I would begin to teach. And as my teaching, theoretically, gained more fame, I would have people applying to follow me. People would listen to the teaching and they would go, you know what? I really resonate with that, or I want to know more, and they would begin to, apply to follow someone. Jesus does it in the opposite way. He goes to people who have not expressed any interest at all in following him and says, follow me. Isn't that strange? It's like going up to someone in the street and offering them a job without asking them if they have any experience or desire to work in the industry. Just, do you want a job? Sure, I would love a job. Great, you start on Monday. What's the job? Which is the next curious bit about this. Again, if you've been in churches for a while, you're probably familiar with the call, right? Come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people. If you're familiar with older translations, it's I will make you fishers of men. Have you ever thought how strange that is? That's not very clear at all what Jesus means, is it? I mean, fishing metaphors for fishermen probably work, but I don't understand fishing metaphors, right? Like, I don't get it. And when you think about it, we often associate fishing for people with salvation. But that doesn't work at all. Again, not much of a fisherman, but it seems to me that once I have caught the fish, it's not saved. Unless it's that fishing show where I kind of show you how big it is and then kind of put it back in the water, right? Normally, when I catch the fish, it's judgment day for the fish. And Jesus never clarifies what he means. When he starts the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, which is not very far from this call, he doesn't start by saying, now, anyone who's followed me and is wondering what that whole fishing metaphor is about, let me explain. Matthew actually mentions a couple of other times some fishing metaphors, one in a parable incidentally about judgment. So there's this really kind of bizarre group of people who are called to something that they're not exactly certain about what it is. And on top of that, Jesus has done nothing to justify their following. If you had just picked up the Gospel of Matthew and you had started at the very beginning and you had read through the birth accounts and you read through his baptism and his testing in the wilderness, you would notice that none of this takes place in or around Capernaum. Just before Jesus calls his disciples, we're told that he begins to preach. And the summary of his message is, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. At this point in time, he has performed no miraculous signs and wonders. He has changed no water into wine. He has walked on no water. He has calmed no storm. He has healed no blind person. He has cast out no demons. He hasn't fed anyone miraculously with anything. He has done almost nothing to justify their decision to follow him. He is an unproven teacher who calls them to a vague following, and they're the wrong sorts of people. It's a bit of an odd passage, wouldn't you say, all of a sudden? Which leads to the fourth thing that is, I think, most curious and most critical about this, and that is that Jesus has no prerequisites for following him apart from the willingness to do so. Did you notice that? Jesus does not come up to them and grill them about their belief. He doesn't say, hello, boys. Do you believe that I am the Son of God, the incarnation of the divine will, the fulfillment of prophecy, the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world? If you answered yes, you can follow me. He doesn't do that. Nor does he grill them on the law. Hey, boys, any idea what's in Exodus 15? No? Sorry. Nor does he ask them about how holy and righteous they are. Gentlemen, I have a few questions about just how holy and pure you are. Because if you meet the standard, you might be able to follow me. There are no conditions laid down at all apart from the willingness to follow. Following is the very beginning. It's prior to belief. Now, the disciples don't actually come to belief in Jesus until much, much, much later in the book, like near the end of the book. It's one of the tensions in the story. We wonder how long it's going to take before these disciples reach the crisis of faith, because there is a crisis of faith. There is a crisis of faith. When you begin to follow Jesus, even if you don't believe in him, eventually you're going to come to that moment when you have to figure out whether you do or not. Right, his claims are just so extraordinary. His teaching is so extraordinary. What he ends up doing is so confronting that eventually there's a crisis of faith, but it's not at the beginning. And the disciples, they're just a really curious group. All the way through the Gospels, they have doubts. At several points in time, Jesus himself asks them, do you still have no faith? And this isn't in chapter 5, right after the call. This is like well into the piece. He calms the storm and then asks, do you have no faith? He walks on water and then says, do you have no faith? After he's fed another crowd of people and the disciples have misunderstood him again, he says, do you have no faith? Do you really not understand? This is well into the story. They misunderstand his teaching again and again and again. They think that the kingdom is about influence and power and status, not about service and love. They just don't get it. And yet none of these things, their lack of faith, their doubts, their misunderstandings, none of them disqualify them from following Jesus. Is that curious? In chapter 10, Jesus sends them out to preach the kingdom, to cast out demons, to heal the sick, before Peter has actually had that inspiration to say, you're the Messiah, aren't you? Before they figured out that Jesus was the Messiah, he'd sent them on mission. Isn't that remarkable? Following is prior to belief. And this makes some sense of all the other things that are curious. Jesus didn't need to prove himself to them immediately because he just wanted them to begin following him. He didn't actually need to be really clear about what the call to follow him would mean because it was going to be worked out. And he didn't have to call the right sorts of people because the following was the important thing. I would say that this is my favorite Latin phrase, but it's the only Latin phrase I know. It is also my favorite. Solvitur ambulando. It means it is solved by walking. It's the simple principle that in so many areas of our lives, there comes a time when we just can't think about it anymore. We've just got to do it. And for those of you who have children, you might remember this conversation. Are we ready to have children? And it doesn't matter who you talk to or how many books you read, it is solved by actually having children. When you realize that, no, we were not ready to have children, right? By then it's too late. And you daren't share that with anyone else who's thinking about it, do you? It's solved by walking. It's true in so many areas of our lives. We just solve things by working them out. And following Jesus is something like that. And this has enormous implications for us. Has enormous implications. It means that anyone can begin to follow Jesus. Anyone who is interested and willing to begin to follow Jesus can begin to follow Jesus without meeting any conditions. They do not have to be so righteous to begin to follow Jesus. They do not have to have so much knowledge. They don't have to have any faith. They can just be willing to begin to follow him. And Jesus says, follow me. Follow me. Oh, the crisis of faith will come. The crisis of faith will come. If you begin to follow Jesus, you're going to rub up against his claims. You're going to rub up against his teachings. You're going to come to a point eventually where you're going to have to make that decision, but you do not have to make it at the beginning. You can begin to follow Jesus. So if you feel that you're not the right sort of person, either you're not nearly holy enough, or you don't know your Bible well enough, or you have doubts and questions, concerns, you don't have enough knowledge, whatever it is, whatever you feel disqualifies you, whether you're here this morning, whether you're watching this somewhere else, you can begin to follow Jesus. You can begin to follow Jesus. But it also has an implication for those of us who have begun to follow Jesus and have come to the crisis of faith and have placed our trust in Jesus. And the implication is that following, because it's prior to belief, lasts beyond belief. Belief is not the end game. Jesus didn't want people to follow him until they believed and then they could go off and live their life. He didn't say to the disciples, follow me until you believe and then you can do something else. He wants them to follow him always. And to think that belief is the end game is like saying that marriage is the end game of a relationship. Right? Now, as soon as I get to know my girlfriend well enough, and I ask the question, and she says yes, and we actually say I do, once I've achieved that, I'm done. Which is a good way to guarantee you won't have a long marriage. And you won't have to worry about the question of whether you're ready to have children. The relationship's the important part, isn't it? Marriage is a step along the way that changes the relationship, but it's still the relationship that matters. It's like learning. You know, we send our kids off to primary school and high school, and then they go to TAFE or college or uni, and by the end of it all, they're thinking, I just need to get a job. But to say that the end of learning is to get a job is to make sure you never advance in your job. You may not even keep your job for very long. You must continue to learn. Getting a job changes things. It's going to focus the areas where you end up learning and growing and developing, but learning continues. The day you stop learning is the day you begin to die, isn't it? Following Jesus changes when we believe in him, but does not negate the need to follow him. We are all followers of Jesus. And so regardless of whether you are just beginning to think about maybe following Jesus, you've got a little bit of willingness and curiosity to do so, or whether you have been following Jesus for a long time, can I encourage you to continue to follow Jesus? If you think that you'd like to begin to explore who Jesus is and you'd like to do it here, we'd love for you to do it here. We'd like to take the same unconditional approach that Jesus did. We don't want to put demands on your righteousness or your knowledge or your faith too early. But we'd like to invite you to begin to follow Jesus here, to ask your questions, to figure it out, to come to the crisis of faith with us. And for those of you who have begun to believe in Jesus, do not settle for belief. Following Jesus is prior to belief and ultimately demands a deeper relationship, a greater degree of maturity, ongoing knowledge, things that we talk about frequently. But for those of you who are either beginning to or perhaps are continuing to follow Jesus, can I suggest that you do a couple of things? Be good to begin to figure out what Jesus actually says about himself. Get yourself a Bible and begin to read it. Unlike most books where we say start at the beginning and work your way all the way through the end, I would suggest you start about 2/3 of the way through. Start with what Jesus has to say. There's a time and a place for the Old Testament. I'm reading through the Bible in a year. I've just waded through the last part of Exodus, and I'm in Leviticus now. It's meaty stuff. When you get there, ask me. We can have a conversation about that. And start with the Gospels. Figure out what Jesus has to say. And as you are reading, ask yourself, what does this text say to me and what do I need to do about it? And then do something about it. You know, one of the things that you'll be challenged with if you read through Matthew's account is that there's quite a bit of Jesus' teaching. Well, begin to put his teaching into practice. That's a great way to follow Jesus. Begin to follow him. You may still have doubts. You may still not have nearly enough knowledge to do so, but begin to follow him. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Give that a try. Look out for those around you and put their needs ahead of your own. And Jesus says, turn the other cheek. I'm sure there's going to be some opportunity this week when someone is going to say or do something to you that makes you want to retaliate in like kind. Well, turn the other cheek. Begin to follow the teaching of Jesus and see what difference it makes. I'd also really encourage you to find a community of faith, if not this one, then somewhere where you can actually begin to follow Jesus with other followers of Jesus. To go through some of the practices and disciplines that those who follow Jesus have done for thousands of years. Not only worshiping together and hearing from his word, but also to learn what it means to pray. And prayer is at one level remarkably simple, and another it is remarkably complex. At its simplest, it's about engaging with God. And prayer is as simple as speaking to God, assuming that he is there, assuming that he listens, assuming that he cares, bringing our gratitude, our requests, our needs, our concerns, our questions, our doubts, our fears, and beginning the process of engaging with God in that. And you'll find that like any great skill, there are all sorts of things to learn and to explore and to experience within that space. But can I encourage you, whether you are just beginning or have been in need of a reminder, to follow Jesus? Over the weeks to come, we want to examine the things that Jesus says about himself, the claims he makes about himself, the things that we're told he did, and to think about what that means for following him, what the implications are. And I trust that whether you're at the very beginning or well down the path, that this will deeply encourage you in your own following after Jesus.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
To follow Jesus is the very beginning, but also the aim. Belief along the way certainly changes the way we follow, but it doesn't mean you can't follow Jesus now. There are no conditions apart from a willingness to begin to explore what it means. And so we want to invite you to join us as we continue to learn what it means to love and follow Jesus here. We trust that during this series you'll be challenged by the teachings, by the life, and by the claims that Jesus makes, and that you'll be able to figure out a little bit more clearly what it means for you to follow Jesus. We trust you've been blessed. Hope to see you again soon.